I may not be the fastest. I may not be the tallest or the strongest. I may not be the best or the brightest. But one thing I can do better than anyone else, that is to be me, which is a poem that you wrote.
Well, finally, that's all you can do, isn't it? You can do a good job of doing that. Do a good job of being me, being yourself. That's really all I ask of myself. Because, as I said, I wasn't the fastest, and I wasn't the brightest, and whatever, you know.
Around the world as Star Trek.
Leonard Nimoy, the actor.
This morning we are remembering a beloved actor who became an enduring fixture in pop culture. Leonard Nimoy.
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 Leonard Nimoy has died at the age of 83.
When word came out today that actor Leonard Nimoy had died, the president said, "I love Spock."
I have been, and always shall be, your friend. Live long and prosper.
Listen to this. I just received an email from Will Wheaton. Leonard Nimoy's son is working on a documentary that he started with his father before he passed away. It's about Mr. Spock and his impact on our culture.
For the Love of Spock, Adam Nimoy, Mark.
We wanted to do something to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, which was coming up in 2016. And a documentary about Spock had never really been produced before. I thought it was an interesting idea to create a film just focused on Spock, who he is, how he came about, and why he has continued to resonate for 50 years. All is as a part of the celebration of the anniversary of the original series. And the minute I suggested this to Dad, he was in. Although my father had a long and prosperous life and hadn't smoked in years, he died from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from over 30 years of cigarette smoking. After Dad died, it became clear that the film needed to include his life as well as the life of Mr. Spock. And that in turn led me on a journey of self-discovery about my relationship with my father.
Well, I'm from Boston originally. I've been in Los Angeles working in films off and on for about 17 years. I started acting when I was a little boy, about 8 years old, in neighborhood settlement houses in Boston, and kind of grew up into it. I just kept doing it because I liked it, and then suddenly just decided that I liked it enough to want to make a career of it. So I came to California in 1949 and started acting in films then.
Now, my parents were extremely diligent, responsible, practical people. I grew up during the Depression. When I told them at age 17 that I was going to study drama at the Pasadena Playhouse and become an actor, they were grief-stricken. They tried to dissuade me, by refusing to give me the tuition, saying, "You'll have to do it without any help from us."
They were totally against it because they certainly hoped he would work into another profession of some kind. But he wasn't suited for all that. He wanted to do what he wanted to do.
Being stubborn, I saved some money by selling vacuum cleaners. I bought a train ticket, and I headed west to California. So I'm walking down the streets of Pasadena on a hot September day, sweat pouring. I'm wearing a wool suit, a hand-painted tie, and suede shoes. I must have looked like somebody just arrived off the boat from Transylvania.
My mom was an aspiring actress, and she met my dad backstage at a theater in Hollywood. But she gave all that up to become a housewife. My sister was born in '55. My dad was in the service then. Then my parents came back to Los Angeles, and I was born in '56. My mother told me that when my sister Julie and I were young, my father was very involved in helping her take care of us. One of my favorite memories of my dad was he hustled his ass during the early '60s, doing all kinds of jobs. He was servicing fish tanks. He set them up in doctors' offices. It was like sort of a fad in the '60s, and Dad had a corner on that market. We knew that Dad sold freezers. You know, he worked in a pet store.
He drove a cab. He took care of aquariums.
He had vending machines at one point, so he had all these little trinkets kept in boxes.
He worked at Will Wright's ice cream parlor.
He was managing an apartment building. He was not around. And even when Dad was at home, it was all these home improvement projects. My father was truly a Renaissance man. He could do just about anything, like build that massive brick wall in our backyard.
He was trying so hard to get this career going, to make his life, to do what he wanted to do, which was be in the arts, be an actor.
One of my idols was Lon Chaney, who was called the man of 1,000 faces in the movie because he changed characters so drastically from one performance to another. And I consider myself that kind of a person. I go to the makeup department, the wardrobe department, and get something together and find a character.
What you looking at? Nothing. What's that for? For nothing. Next time you want to look at me, line forms to the right. 2 bits admission.
If they see water in the desert where there is no water, it's their eyes that lie, not my mouth.
Just having any of those coins in your possession is liable to lead you to a lot more trouble than you bargained for.
Have no fear for me, Marshal. No man kills the bee. He only wants to follow him to the honey.
He's a fine man. Hasn't had a decent break in 20 years. Now he's been built up a little bit. He's got a little dignity, a little stature. You're not going to deny he was a good Marine and a good officer.
No, he was both.
Then why crucify him?
You don't get it, do you, Sanders? I don't have any choice.
Yellow.
I'm not going to let you do it.
It's for you, Lieutenant.
I did this job in an episode of the Lieutenant series. A few weeks after I finished the job, my agent called me and said, Gene Roddenberry saw the footage, was interested in you, liked what you did, and said that he has in mind for you a role in a pilot that he's developing for a science fiction series, period. I really didn't give it a lot of thought. You hear that kind of thing, and you're a long way from getting a job.
What about some of the characters on the show? Did you create them with certain actors in mind?
Leonard Nimoy was the one actor I definitely had in mind, and I thought to myself, if I ever do this science fiction that I want to do. He'd make a great alien, and with those cheekbones, some sort of a pointed ear might go well. Guy simply made one phone call to Leonard. He came in, and that was it.
So I went to this meeting expecting to be auditioned or to read for him or whatever. He was very congenial and said, let's take a walk. And he walked me over to the scenic design department. He showed me the plans of the sets that were being built, introduced me to the scenic designer, walked me over to the prop department, showed me some of the props that were being made. Wardrobe department, same thing. Here's some sketches of the clothes. This is interesting. It's like he's selling me on doing this job. That if I keep my mouth shut, I might have a job here. You know? Prior to Star Trek, I never had a job that lasted longer than 2 weeks in any television show or movie. Never. 2 weeks.
Mr. Spock here. We're intercepting.
I didn't have a cool look in mind at first. I had this jagged haircut and bushy eyebrows, and we went through a struggle with the ears.
The studio had contracted with a company to do special effects for the show, not film special effects, but items like suits for creatures, creature outfits, and that kind of thing. And included in the contract was the ears. They were supposed to do the ears. Now, they were very good at creating creatures, and we used them throughout the series, this particular company. But they were not really specialists in the very fine, delicate kind of appliance work that's necessary to add something to a person's features and make it really look like it's part of that person. We came right down within about 3 or 4 days of shooting the series. And I said to Gene Roddenberry, this is not going to work, and maybe we just better forget about the ears. Well, he insisted he wanted the ears to be part of the character. And he said, you try it, and let's work it out. Let's solve the problem. And at the end of 13 shows, if you're not satisfied with the ears, I'll write a script where Spock gets an ear job. So we went ahead and worked on the problem. And Fred Phillips, who was the actual makeup man who was going to do my makeup each day on the series, knew what the problem was. And a couple days before we started shooting, he called an appliance specialist. And we very quickly went to him, got the ears done in about 24 hours, and they were ready and they were perfect. And that solved the problem.
Freddie Phillips always said that Leonard Nimoy reported for work at 6:30 a.m., and Mr. Spock could always be counted on to arrive somewhere around 7:15.
Definitely something out there, Captain, headed this way. Now, our tests indicate the planet's surface without considerably more vegetation or some animals, simply too barren to support life.
The first pilot did not sell, but the NBC thought it was too cerebral was the term they used.
The network found the first pilot too cerebral, they said. Not straight line story enough, and unusual in that they decided to try a second pilot. NBC told Gene to fire almost the entire cast, including me. Well, Gene felt very strongly that the Vulcan character that I was to portray, that every time I was on screen, you'd be reminded that we have a mixed crew. So he stuck to his guns, fortunately for me.
The original pilot even had a different captain, Jeff Hunter. The only actor that stayed over was Leonard Nimoy.
And then I had a shock. I opened up my mail, and it was a pamphlet from the NBC Sales and Promotion Department. And it was a pamphlet about Star Trek, this new series that's going to be on the air coming in the fall. I saw this photograph of myself as Spock, and it didn't look right. Something struck me as strange. And the closer I looked, the more I realized that they had straightened out my eyebrows, made them look normal, and they had taken off the tips off the ears. The network said, we are very dependent on the numbers in the Bible Belt, and they will not accept in their homes a character who looks devilish with these pointed ears.
Are you casting me in the role of Satan?
Not at all, Captain.
Is there anyone on this ship who even remotely looks like Satan?
I am not aware of anyone who fits that description, Captain.
No, Mr. Spock. I didn't think you would. Dr. Dana feels he isn't that dangerous. What makes you right and a trained psychiatrist wrong?
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic. In my opinion, we'll be lucky if we can repair this ship and get away in time.
One of the reasons for the shift in the Spock character when you came on board was because when I was working with Jeffrey Hunter was a very internalized actor, very fine actor. This was his style of work. There's an old joke about two actors preparing to play a scene, and one says to the other, what are you going to play in this scene? And the fellow says, I'm playing nothing. The other one says, no, you can't play nothing, I'm playing nothing. So here's Jeffrey Hunter playing this quiet, internalized performance. And I felt the need to help drive something in opposition to that.
Right,
Otherwise,
right.
we're both playing nothing.
Right.
And when you came on board with your energy and a sense of humor and a twinkle in the eye, I was able to then become the cooler Spock.
Has it occurred to you that there's a certain inefficiency in constantly questioning me on things you've already made up your mind about?
It gives me emotional security.
Leonard bouncing off of me could now dramatically be internal, allowing me to be external, and the two forces made an interesting combination.
I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
That is very kind of you, Captain.
You know, I don't know if I had played Kirk that it would have dawned on me to have a sense of humor with Spock. I don't know that I would have thought of that. But Shatner's take on it was, I can fuck with Spock. I mean, you know, and without being offensive to the character. I can play with him.
Certain you don't know what irritation is?
The fact one of my ancestors married a human female.
Terrible, having bad blood like that.
Those two characters are the yin and yang. They are that in front of the camera, and it works beautifully, magnificently.
There must be some intelligent form of life on Thasus. He could not possibly have survived alone. The ship's food concentrates would have been exhausted in a year or so.
By which time he would have been eating fruits, vegetables,
Probes
and
of Thasus indicate very little
And
able
probes
plant
have
life.
been known to be wrong,
Doctor,
Mr.
are you
Spock.
speaking scientifically or emotionally?
I thought the character of McCoy, played by D. Kelly, made that, as the fans call it, the triumvirate, because he was the common man, certainly a brilliant doctor, but he had all of the irritations, frustrations, the reactions that most people would have.
I, for one, could use a good non-reconstituted meal.
Doctor, you are a sensualist.
You bet your pointed ears I am.
It's actually an interesting sort of triumvirate between Spock, Bones, and Kirk. And for Kirk, Spock is his, you know, they're like the devil and the angel on his shoulder, really. Spock is his intelligence and his logic and his sense, and, you know, McCoy is more his sort of slightly more emotional, slightly more, you know, knee-jerk kind of side.
The banter between McCoy and Spock was, you know, often some of the, you know, most fun elements in the show and indeed in the movies.
What's the matter, Spock?
There's something disquieting about these creatures.
I don't know too much about these little tribbles yet, but there is one thing that I have discovered.
What is that, Doctor?
I like them better than I like you.
Doctor.
Yes.
They do indeed have one redeeming characteristic.
What's that?
They do not talk too much.
You have the kind of cynical wit of McCoy, and you have the swagger and braggadocio of Kirk, and then you have the intellect and cold reason of Spock. He's like the perfect human being all wrapped up in one.
The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
That first night of the premiere, we had to actually go to some friend's house because they had a color TV, a big console color TV. We did not. We had a big console black and white.
Why don't you tell me I'm an attractive young lady? Or ask me if I've ever been in love? Tell me how your planet Vulcan looks on a lazy evening when the moon is full.
Vulcan has no moon, Miss Uhura.
I'm not surprised, Mr. Spock.
Dad in his costume, Vulcan costume. It was like, wow, this is really cool. I remember it was just such an exciting night for us.
This is not Nancy. If she were Nancy, could she take this?
Stop it! Stop it, Spock! Stop it!
You read?
Frequency open, Mr. Spock.
Spock here, Captain.
Corbett discovers there are parasites.
When I came to visit the set, they started shooting that first season at the end of May and early June in 1966. I was 9, almost 10 years old, and I was off for summer vacation. And this is why Dad would take me to work with him. I would get up early in the morning and we would drive to Desilu right next to the Paramount lot. And I'd be there all day.
So I went out to California, and of course Leonard took care. I stayed up there at Leonard's home, and he said, "Guess what? I've got this new show. This is 1960." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's called Star Trek." He said, "You've got to come on the set." I said, "Of course." You know, I'm in the theater, and this is my first time in Hollywood. And I'm out there, and I walk on the set, and I see Leonard. He comes out. He came out from the dressing room, and I see his hair. I see these eyebrows up to here, and I see these ears on him. And I said, "Geez, what is this?" You know. And he did a scene, and he was terrific in the scene. But I said, I got him to the side. I couldn't believe it. I said, Leonard, I've got to talk to you. I said, no matter what you do, you've got to get out of this as soon as you possibly can. This is a treadmill to oblivion.
The review that Variety gave us when we first went on the air in September of 1966. And I thought you'd enjoy hearing what our show business Bible said about us the first week we went on the air. This is dated September, it appeared on September 14th, 1966, just a little over 25 years ago. It said, Star Trek with William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy. Star Trek won't work. That's the opening line. Then it says, an incredible and dreary mess of confusion, trudged on for a long hour, with hardly any relief from violence, killings, hypnotic stuff, and a distasteful, ugly monster. William Shatner, shh. William Shatner appears wooden, it says. I didn't say it, it says it here, right? I've never heard him accused of being wooden before, you know. Spock! Scotty! I need warp speed in 4 minutes, we're all dead. Then it says, the same goes for Leonard Nimoy.
There are 500 or 1,000 who could play our characters effectively. There's only one person who could play Mr. Spock.
Spock called for exactly the kind of work I was prepared to do. He was a character with a rich and dynamic inner life, half human, half Vulcan. He was the embodiment of the outsider, like the immigrants who surrounded me in Boston in my early years. How do you find your way as the alien in a foreign culture?
Keep your fucking hands off me. Just keep away. Your feelings might be hurt, you green-blooded half-breed.
May I say that I have not thoroughly enjoyed serving with humans. I find their illogic and foolish emotions a constant irritant.
Then transfer out, freak!
Most everyone, and there are exceptions, but most everyone feels a little bit like an outsider. I would argue the most interesting people seem to. So there's something wonderfully comforting and relatable to know that Spock felt that way himself.
I grew up as a skinny, nerdy, gay kid in the South, you know, in the 70s. Not exactly a comfortable existence. You know, there's a lot of internal conflict. So the character of Spock, from the very beginning, and, you know, when I was 5, I didn't know why, or 7, I didn't know why, but I was captivated by this character that was based on internal conflict.
Spock, I think people recognize themselves in him. He is an outsider. He's the alien.
I think everyone feels like an outsider sometimes, and since he's a non-human outsider, it's an otherness that everybody can relate to in their own way.
People sometimes think they don't belong in a group. And really, that's what I found. You know, I was very tall from when I was young, and I felt apart from other people. And I really associated with that character.
I think it was the very first episode we were filming after the pilot, when we started into production, that there was a scene in which the ship was being threatened by some outside problems, an outside dangerous force. And there was a lot of activity on the ship. The captain was saying, do such and such, press this button, do this, warp 3, get us out of here. And so forth.
Overloading, sir.
And Spock had one word to say, and the word was fascinating. And we're looking at this thing on the screen, you know, and everybody else is reacting, oh, look at it, blah, 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 blah. And I got caught up in that energy, and I said, fascinating. And the director gave me a brilliant note. He said, be different, be the scientist, be detached. See it as something that's a curiosity rather than a threat.
Fascinating.
Well, a big chunk of the character was born right there.
If I seem insensitive to what you're going through, Captain, understand. It's the way I am.
A lesser actor would say, why would I want to play him? He doesn't have any emotions, but he has so many emotions.
But he also has emotional control. Expresses very little of what he's feeling, and I think it's fun for the audience to watch to see if there's a glimmer of something pops through.
I had a very interesting conversation with your father about Spock, because we were talking about him as a cold, unemotional guy. And Leonard said, I never played him that way. I always played him as a guy trying to keep his emotions in check. And I thought that was a subtle and ingenious choice, because it lent a dynamic tension to what you saw on the screen, particularly in the close-ups of a guy trying to keep a lid on it.
That thing must be destroyed.
You tried to destroy it once before, Commodore. The result was a wrecked ship and a dead crew.
I am officially notifying you that I am exercising my option under regulations as a Starfleet Commodore, and that I am assuming command of the Enterprise. You can't let him do this. Doctor, you are out of line. So are you, sir. Well, Spock?
Unfortunately, Starfleet Order 104, Section B leaves me no alternative.
Mr. Spock, I order you to assume command on my personal authority as captain of the Enterprise.
Commodore Decker, you are relieved of command.
I don't recognize your authority to relieve me.
Commodore, I do not wish to place you under arrest.
You're bluffing.
Vulcans never bluff.
I talked about at the time being heavily influenced by what I saw Harry Belafonte do on stage one night. He came out on stage and a spotlight came up on him and he was there. He just stood there very quietly. Applause. Next song, stood there quietly and sang. And then he must have been on stage 10 or 15 minutes. He was just standing with his hands on his thighs and sang. And when he made a gesture, it was like the whole place shook. It was like, wow! You know? It was gigantic. Wow, what a lesson. If you are minimal, then that becomes a big deal. If you are minimal, that becomes a big deal.
He's gone.
You make a comment with an eyebrow that's just as powerful as throwing punches.
He didn't wield the human side frivolously for effect. He would, most of the time it would be contained, but occasionally, you know, most notably at the end of A Mock Time when he realizes that he didn't kill Kirk, there's a sweet moment of like, Jim! Which is just so, it's so earned.
There can be no excuse for the crime of which I'm guilty. I intend to offer no defense. Furthermore, I shall order Mr. Scott to take immediate command of this vessel.
Don't you think you better check with me first?
Captain! Jim! I'm pleased to see you, Captain. You seem uninjured.
What is the purpose of a toy?
To be played with.
Therefore, to not play with it would be...
illogical. Oh, damn it, Spock, you're right.
You can look at a lot of progenitor characters for Sheldon, but absolutely one of them is Spock. Yeah. Absolutely. And in fact, in the episode in which Sheldon is interviewed for this very documentary that I am currently speaking to you in, one of the things Sheldon talks about is his desire to be Spock, and that's not a new invention. That's something that has existed for that character from the very beginning.
When I was 8 years old, Billy Sparks cornered me in the playground. I asked myself, what would Spock do? Then I grabbed Billy on his shoulder and performed my first Vulcan nerve pinch.
Did it work?
No, he broke my collarbone.
So the script was written that Spock comes up behind, sneaks up behind the mean Kirk and hits him on the head with the butt of a gun. That's what was written in the script. So I said to the director, I think we should do something different than that. He said, what do you mean? What do you have in mind? And I said, well, Spock is a graduate of the Vulcan Institute of Technology, where he took a number of courses in human anatomy. And Vulcans have a kind of energy that comes off their fingertips, which, if properly applied to the appropriate pressure points on the human anatomy, will render a human unconscious. The guy didn't know what I was talking about. But I told him, and he knew exactly what I was talking about. And when I came up behind him and I put my hand on his neck, he's the one that sold it. He went like that and dropped like a rock.
There's a multi-legged creature crawling on your shoulder.
I'd like you to teach me that sometime.
Our minds are merging, Doctor. Our minds are one. I feel what you feel. I know what you know.
I like the fact that Spock could communicate with other species through thoughts rather than through words. Brilliant.
What in the name of...
The man talked to a rock, for goodness sake, in the Hornet. Oh, she's pregnant. It's a rock. Okay, that was good, because the rock is not going to speak English to you. Think of how many science fiction stories in that decade and the decades preceding where you'd meet aliens and the aliens spoke English. We didn't think that that would not happen. You got to crawl before you walk, I get that. But Star Trek not only knew how to crawl and knew how to walk, it was running.
The Vulcan greeting is a wonderful sentiment. Live long and prosper. And this, too, was something that was contributed by your father on the set.
We had a wonderful script by Theodore Sturgeon called Amok Time. We arrive on the planet, and a procession comes out from the city to greet us. I said to the director, I think we should have some kind of a special greeting. Asian people bow to each other. Military people salute each other. I think Vulcans should have some kind of a greeting. And he said, what would you like to do? And I said, how about this? Where it came from was from my childhood, going to synagogue on the high holidays with my family. There's a moment where a group of men get up before the congregation, cover their heads with their prayer shawls, chant a prayer. My father said, don't look. I'm about 8 or 9 years old, so I snuck a peek. And what I saw was these gentlemen out there who were doing the shouting had their hands out towards the congregation like that, both hands. I found out later this is the shape of the letter Shin in the Hebrew alphabet. The letter Shin is the first letter in the word Shaddai, the name of God. Well, I survived. I peeked and I survived.
But I was so intrigued with that gesture, and I suggested that we do that as Vulcans. Within days after that episode was on the air, I started getting that gesture back on the streets.
You know, a lot of times people ask me what it was like living with Spock. And for the most part during that period, Dad was not home much at all. I didn't see him.
He was really focused on what he was doing at the studio and for the show.
His usual routine during the week was he would get up very early. He'd come home at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, eat his dinner, memorize his lines. He'd run the lines with my mother, and then just go to sleep and start all over again. So during the week, he wasn't around hardly at all.
We spent a lot of, quite a few years, actually from Star Trek to Mission, with him not being home during the weekdays.
Even when Dad was around at home, oftentimes he was very quiet and remote. He was still kind of in his Spock bag because he liked to stay in character.
You play a character like that, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, 5 days a week. Most of your waking life then is in that character. And I find it very difficult to turn it on and turn it off. So stepping out of the set and into a chair waiting for the next setup, I couldn't shift out of it. I believed in making that investment in the character, particularly that kind of character that was so boxed.
A lot of the time he wasn't available to hang out with, to do things with. He was sort of in his world.
That he was occasionally Leonard-like, but mostly he was Spock. So I never really got to know him very well. I got to know Spock a little bit better than I got to know your dad. I mean, he was totally dedicated to playing that character and to being that character, and showed.
If I stay in character or kind of don't joke around, it's more a function of me. It's a slightly closer to being a panicked grip than it is being an artist, I'm afraid. It's just I don't want to lose it.
You kind of have to get into the character's head, and if you come out of it and then they go, roll camera, if you're off by that much, you could either underplay a moment or overplay a moment.
Fan mail started arriving pretty regularly in late '66, and there was some issue whether or not the studio would handle the mail, the network would handle the mail. They didn't want to do it. They wanted, Leonard to handle the mail, which he did in his office for a while. There was an interview in 16 magazine, I think it was the spring of '67, and somehow, accidentally, they published our home address as the mailing address for the fan mail. Within days, the mailman stopped coming. It was a truck that arrived with sacks of mail. And we were answering it. It came into our dining room. We had our dining room table all set up with the mail that we opened, and we stuffed envelopes with this early Spock promo picture. It was one of our family activities, was answering fan mail.
Personal life was gone.
Yeah, it started happening very fast, and to show you how naive I was, at that time I still had my phone listed in the phone book and my address, and it was all, I'd never dreamed that there was going to be that kind of impact, because I'd been on television before and been in movies before, and I was listed in the phone book. It didn't matter to me.
We started getting a lot of fan mail, not only fan mail, but fans coming to our door, knocking down the door.
We started getting people driving by the house and parking and ripping at the shrubbery to have a souvenir, and taking my grass and my leaves and whatever. Some of them would knock on the door and ask to be invited in to visit.
It got really crazy. Yeah, it got really crazy for a while.
What about when you came back to Boston during the Star Trek years?
Yeah, that was kind of exciting and a little difficult. People were following me on the street, and I didn't really want people to know where I was living. I was staying with my folks, with your grandparents. Right. And they didn't have any idea what Star Trek was. They didn't get it. All they knew was something had happened.
Well, how did they react when they saw your haircut?
My dad actually thought I was wearing a wig. He had a picture of me as Spock up on the wall in the barber shop, and kids would come in and say, I want a Spock haircut. Once word filtered through to network executives about Spock's popularity, they said to Roddenberry, say, why aren't you doing more with that Martian on the show?
there's that element of competition, particularly the first season, because the titular star was Bill Shatner. Leonard was the secondary character. But when the show went on the air, people were absolutely magnetically attracted to Spock.
So I'm asked to be the captain, and then it's the captain show, and that's great. Quite frequently, another character rises to the top as well. I go to Roddenberry, who then says very wisely, if Spock is popular, then Kirk is popular, and the show is popular, and that's what we all want. And I thought, you know, he's right. And from that moment on, I encompassed the popularity of Spock and was okay with it and enjoyed it.
Jim, when I feel friendship for you, I'm ashamed. You've got to hear me.
Kirk is the physical embodiment of the show, and Spock is the spiritual embodiment of the show. And I think it's how these two guys carved out their specific spaces in this little universe. Kirk was always doing wild and crazy things and sleeping with aliens. And Spock was always thoughtful and moving in a very deliberate way and sort of putting the brakes on some of the more physical urges that people had.
You can save it, girls. This type can turn himself off from any emotion.
I think that his Vulcan side prevents him from allowing the testosterone in his human side to get the best of him. And that is very appealing for women, at least for women like me. I don't, motorcycles and car boils and it's not my thing. I like more of an intellectual, humble soul that kind of blows your mind in just a conversation. And I feel like Spock is like that. So I wouldn't be surprised why women found him really appealing.
Bridge to Captain Kirk.
Kirk here.
I had no idea.
What?
He's so much more handsome in person. Those eyes.
Kirk had quite the reputation as a ladies' man.
Not him. Spock.
There was just something about him that women found attractive. He himself was kind of flirty, and women kind of flirted with him.
You only take a mate once every 7 years.
The 7-year cycle is biologically inherent in all Vulcans. At that time, the mating drive outweighs all other motivations.
And is there nothing that can disturb that cycle, Mr. Spock?
When did you get first interested in the fellas?
Spock.
And what was it about him?
He was so repressed, and you just wanted to make him scream.
I'm rather repressed.
I don't think this is that different from the which Beatle do you love most. You know, I like the less emotional, more, you know, kind of obtuse, bizarre type. So I think there's always going to be a Spock female versus a Kirk female.
I was one of the first to find them. The spores.
Spores?
Now you belong to all of us. And we to you. There's no need to hide your inner face any longer. We understand.
I love you. can love you.
This is the perfect opportunity for a love story for Spock, because the spores release all those things that hold in his emotions, his logic, and will allow him to feel like a real person. And this is unusual for him. It's unknown for him.
But we're happy here. I can't lose you now, Mr. Spock. I can't.
I have a responsibility to this ship, to that man on the bridge. I am what I am, Layla. And if there are self-made purgatories, then we all have to live in them. Mine can be no worse than someone else's.
Cotton candy on a summer day, green grass on a hillside. Could they turn my love around? Could they bring her back to my side?
But he was a better singer than I was. I mean, he could sustain a note, off key, but sustain a note.
Trip to nowhere, a world without love.
He was basically keeping himself busy by making hay while the sun was shining. I mean, that was his whole philosophy. He knew he was riding this wave and it was very exciting, but he also knew that it could be over very quickly. And we could be back into the financial struggle that we were in before Star Trek came along.
I always told him, you can take the boy out of the West End, but you can't take the West End out of the boy.
I live with one.
What does that mean?
Well, he developed a very strong work ethic. I rarely turned down any paid engagement. I'd seen many of my active friends go to work on a series for a few years and live up to the level of their income. And then when the series was canceled, they were once again looking for work with no steady income and no money in the bank. I made a private pact with myself that this would never happen to me and my family. So every time I was offered a paid appearance, I took it. This meant that I left the studio at 5 or 6 o'clock on Friday night, and I took a red-eye flight to my destination. I'd arrive on the East Coast around 6 Saturday morning and catch the last flight out on Sunday night. I can remember a time or two when I got back to Los Angeles at 2 or 3 in the morning on Monday. I'd go right to the studio, stagger into my dressing room, and catch a few hours sleep on the couch. From there, I headed right into makeup.
There were a number of photographers who showed up to take our picture in those early days, 66, 67, and into 68. And we were happy to do it. It was fun, I got to admit. It was like a circus. It was a joyride, and it was really a good time.
First it was like novel, it was great. It was like, oh wow, we're getting our picture taken, we're gonna be in a magazine, it's so cool. But after a while, it got tiresome. It became sort of an invasion of our life and us not really understanding, you know, why do we have to do this? Why is this so important? We were young.
There was one time, I believe it was 1970, there was a photographer there, and we were supposed to come in and take pictures, and Julie and I were like, We joined together, we unionized, and we said no. You can't say no to Leonard, I gotta tell you. It's just, I mean, we felt guilty. We wanted to support him, but we were really done with the whole publicity routine. We took a really good family portrait, which is emblematic, I think, of where we were at that time in our lives, because no one is smiling. in Star Trek in the mid-60s, creating this character who would soon become a pop culture icon. My dad was never really that in touch with what was going on in popular culture. It's so interesting that when he was at home during leisure time, he was listening to records of guys like Yves Montand and Lou Rawls and Charles Aznavour.
Our mom was ahead of her time. At first, when you look back at pictures of her, she was dressed very 50s housewife, but still had style. Dad stayed still very, in his dressing conservative, but Mom tried to, change his style up a bit. And so he started, wearing a little cooler clothes, some jeans, a little scarf, around his neck. And his hair was done a little cooler. Even though he had the Spock haircut, somehow we could brush it off to the side a little bit, and he looked a little hipper. Yeah.
NBC failed to renew Star Trek for a 4th season. A short time after we finished shooting Star Trek, I signed on with Mission Impossible.
Before he started on Mission, there was a press conference in Honolulu announcing that he was joining the show. It was a very exciting experience for me to be there spending time with Dad, although by then sharing him with the fans had become a part of my life.
My character, Paris the Great, was a master of disguise. Therefore, I got to play a multitude of characters. Old men, Asians, South American dictators, blind men, Europeans. But then, before I knew it, I was playing the South American dictator again, and the Asian, and the old man, and the blind guy. It got boring. A short while later, I left the show. After Mission Impossible, I played Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. It was only the first experience in my extremely enjoyable theatrical career.
In Fiddler on the Roof, he was magnificent. He was very precise. He avoided every cliche. And as he grew into the role, he was extravagant.
His portrayal of Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof was utterly fantastic. Probably the best of any I've seen.
Because he was an actor.
Like a real actor.
I think he realized that what would make that work in a non-Broadway setting was it was about him and his wife and his kids. And it was beautifully sculptured.
I went on to appear as Fagin in Oliver, Arthur in Camelot, and a one-man play about Vincent van Gogh.
In the early 70s, Dad was in a play called Man in the Glass Booth, and it was a terrific play. He really owned up to that role. That as I watched him night after night, he was completely unrecognizable to me as my own father.
He had to play a wealthy, braggadocio, vain, egocentric New York Jew. Not a Jewish man, but a Jew. And as the play develops, when the Jew gets arrested as being a concentration camp commandant, he then has to play the meanest, most committed, most devoted Nazi officer you can imagine. And he stands up in the booth, not supposed to do that in Israeli court. He stands up and he's in his regalia, he's in his uniform, but he doesn't have his hat on. And when he put that hat on, he changed. You didn't want to go anywhere near him. Very quietly, and this was him. He starts moving like this. and he marches to the last bit of dialogue. And it gets louder and louder and louder. If a director could come up with that, he should get an award. The actor came up with it, and he should get an award. It was chilling.
The times when your dad was performing in New York, and then we would see each other very often, and that's when they started to go closer. And then we became his groupies. When he performed any place east of the Mississippi, we would fly out to be there.
One summer, he did 2 plays, one in Michigan and one in Wisconsin. And at that time, he was flying his own single-engine airplane, and I flew a lot with him. I love flying, so I plotted the entire course out. I took lessons, and I got my little license. Not a pilot's license, they call it a pinch hitter, so that if anything happened to him, I could take over without a problem. And that was probably one of the best times I ever had with him.
The decade of the 70s was kind of an interesting period for my dad because he had done so much theater work. He was really kind of proving himself as the character actor that he always wanted to be.
He also hosted multiple seasons of In Search of,
underwritten in part by a national
and he was in Philip Kaufman's remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. They were shooting in San Francisco, and I happened to be in school at Berkeley, and it was just a lot of fun watching them make that film.
But what happens to us?
You'll be born again into an untroubled world.
He was a multifaceted individual, that is for sure. I knew that as a kid. I used to watch In Search Of, and I remember him in the Kaufman Body Snatchers and Mission Impossible, you know. He was never just Spock to me, even growing up.
We came here from a dying world. We drift through the universe from planet to planet, pushed on by the solar winds. We adapt, and we survive.
Captain, I found this device on my console. It seems to serve no useful function, and... Captain?
I'm sorry, Spock. It's your... When they began casting, I wasn't called.
It was decided that George and Nichelle would not appear on the series.
And I thought, what's happening? Then it was announced that Bill was cast to do Captain Kirk, Leonard was cast to do Mr. Spock, Jimmy Doohan was cast to do Scotty and all the other male voices, and Majel was cast to do Nurse Chapel and all the female voices. But when Leonard learned of that, he said, what Star Trek is about is diversity coming together and working in concert as a team. And he said the 2 people that most personify that diversity in our cast are Nichelle Nichols and George Takei. And if they're not going to be a part of this, then I'm not interested.
How many times does that happen in this business, you know?
It says a lot about Leonard.
Tuesday, October 22nd, 1973. Dear Adam, this may turn out to be a long letter. I'm very glad I could see you and Julie on Sunday. It was good to be with you. But I think it might have been especially useful in putting our relationship, you and me, in a new perspective. This came out of our argument. I discovered you and I were having a terrible battle on a verbal battleground. I felt very sad about it, and all I could say was, I'm sorry. It suddenly occurred to me that it might be useful if I tell you some things about my relationship with my father. I always loved and feared him, but we had very little real personal contact. He was not a demonstrative man. Most of my day-to-day interaction was with my mother, with my father in the background as a sort of weapon. Neither of them was ever very giving of approval.
You guys were at odds a lot about some of the company you were keeping and some of the things you were doing.
In the early 70s, there was a slight lull in Dad's work career, and he was at home for the first time, hanging out, and not really quite knowing what to do with himself. And it was also during this time when he was taking a close look at me and my life. What he saw was to him not that pretty. Even though I was doing very well in school, I was a senior in high school, and by this time I was like a full-fledged deadhead. I mean, need I say more? I mean, you know, it was just not a good time for us.
In the middle of the earth, in the land of Shire, lives a brave little hobbit whom we all admire. With his long wooden pipe, fuzzy woolly toes, he lives in a hobbit hole and everybody knows him. Bilbo, Bilbo Baggins, he's only 3 feet tall. Bilbo, Bilbo Baggins, the bravest little hobbit of them all.
Captain?
One day Bilbo was asked to go.
What in the name of... Am I seeing things? Not unless I am too. What is it, Mr. Spock?
Having had only marginal success on NBC for 3 years, the show took on new life in syndication. Gradually, the show and its audience found each other. By the mid-70s, it was becoming a media event. Thousands and thousands of new devotees sat in front of their TV sets memorizing each episode's dialogue word for word.
Risk. Risk is our business.
That's what the starship's all about. That's why we're aboard her. Dr. McCoy is right to point out the enormous risk involved with interaction between any two alien species. But the potential.
There's something that I became aware of in doing my research very recently called the slash fantasy, the Kirk-Spock slash fantasy. And there's a phenomenal edited video on YouTube. And somebody has taken a lot of footage of Kirk and Spock out of context from the original series to show this homoerotic relationship between them. And it's pretty damn compelling.
At conventions, I saw slash zines with illustrations done by very good artists, and they were much, much more explicit between Kirk and Spock. It's a matter of who is looking at it, from what perspective, and from the perspective of gay people, seeing that is eye-opening. They see the gay passion, the gay attraction, and the gay anguish depicted in those scenes.
At my first convention in 1972, I walked into a hall so crowded, the thunderous wall of noise that greeted me took me completely by surprise. For several seconds, I literally could not speak because of the emotion.
One of the things that I really respect about your dad was, I guess, his love and affection for the fans, and how he always had time and energy, going to conventions and meeting people. And I'm blown away by how much love there is for your father.
It was an entirely new concept, this gathering of fans to celebrate Trek for a weekend. The organizers crossed their fingers and hoped for 500 attendees. They got 3,000.
We went to one Star Trek convention, I think it was in L.A., but I'm not sure.
I think you're right.
Yeah, it was a wild
I remember them having to get us out the back door.
Right.
Oh, okay. What was that like?
Wild.
I think Star Trek fans have sort of pioneered the whole cosplay culture which now exists, where, you know, you go to any convention and people are dressed up as a multitude of things, from the most obscure to the most popular.
I've been blown away going to now these conventions for a number of years, seeing what people are able and willing and, you know, what they commit to dress up as and do, and it's unbelievable.
You thought they were crazy.
I'm here. I'm really here. I can't believe it. My first Star Trek convention. Watch your back. Here we go. So much stuff. Really cool. Wow. Oh. Wow.
Spock, status report.
Pollux 4, Class M-type planet, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. Sensors indicate no life forms. In all respects, quite ordinary, Captain.
Bobbitt, I want you to tell me a little bit about your history with Star Trek, how it's affected your life.
And I would say it's probably one of the biggest reasons why I work at NASA. I mean, honestly, like, you know, seeing this Star Trek, this, you know, this vision of the future is one of the reasons why I work there today. Seeing a future where people, you know, from all different cultures and backgrounds were working together, you know, the betterment of humanity. I think that was a vision of the future that I wanted to help create. If Star Trek was the vision of the future that I wanted to create, Spock was the internalization of the kind of the person that I felt like I was, right? You know, as someone who was from two cultures, you know, Iranian father, an American mother, I saw in Spock, you know, that same conflict, I guess, of which one am I? Am I both? Is there a happy medium of the two? But also at the same time, I saw that, you know, he was accepted by his, you know, colleagues.
Spock stood for a lot of different things. He stood for intelligence, integrity. He stood for the idea of really searching for truth, for figuring out how things really work. That is the underpinning of science, really. So I think for a lot of people, Spock was a representative of science itself, of using the human mind to overcome kind of the forces of chaos and make sense of things. That really resonates with a lot of people here, I would say. It certainly did with me. And I knew the minute I read Star Trek books that that was the character I most wanted to emulate with my career.
Spock was a scientist. Now, for me, I knew I liked science before Star Trek. So Spock and I resonated, I think, in a way that surely helped but didn't initiate my interest. But I wonder if the slow but real appreciation for what science is and why it matters that I see manifesting today, whether it owes its origin to that series, to that character.
And you're a Star Trek fan? How long have you been a fan?
100 years.
100 years Star Trek fan, okay.
You've had your own connection to Star Trek. You've directed Star Trek episodes. But before that, you were an entertainment attorney. What was that all about? What got you into that in the first place?
You know, it's very difficult when you are the son of a celebrity and somebody who becomes a pop culture icon to try to create your own identity, to find out who you are, in essence. And so this was my way of really creating my own path.
He was very proud of the fact that I went to law school and I started practicing law. But after 7 years of practicing, it became very clear to me that this was not something I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I didn't have the passion for it that I thought was important. That was really Dad's whole philosophy, was you have to have a passion for what you do, otherwise it's just work and it's not fulfilling. My dad was very sympathetic about my desire to make a career change, and even helped me, trained me as a director. He and I actually made an episode of The Outer Limits together. We were remaking an episode that he was originally in the early 60s, in which he had a supporting role.
Your design and your construction are nothing short of genius, but even you must understand that you're basically a takeoff on the thoughts and feelings that Dr. Link programmed into you. A man suffers, a man bleeds. A man has a soul.
I could snap your neck as if it were a toothpick. In that sense, you're right. I'm not like most men. But like most men, I choose not to.
Let me go.
The story of Star Trek, the motion picture, rightly begins in London, where my wife and I were vacationing in 1975. We went to see Henry Fonda, who was performing on stage in Darrow. After the performance, we joined him and his wife for dinner. At some point during the conversation, Henry said, "You know, Leonard, I hope you're being paid for all those billboards around town." "What billboards, Henry? Do you mean to tell me you don't know about all those Heineken billboards?" Now, I'd seen my Spock image used commercially before, such as on a box of Kellogg's cornflakes. I'd been amused by it, finding it campy and even flattering. Once Star Trek was canceled, Paramount had no legal right to license my likeness from that time on. So not only had Paramount been marketing me as Spock for almost 10 years without the right to do so, for the last 5 of those 10, they hadn't sent me any of the proceeds. I wound up having to file a lawsuit.
They wanted to make this movie. And Bob Wise had it in his contract that they would make their best efforts to get me in the movie, and my agent would call me and say, "I want to talk to you about the Star Trek movie." And I would say, when we settle the lawsuit, I'll talk about acting in their movie, because I thought that's my leverage. So that went on for some time. And finally, I got a call for a guy who introduced himself to me. He said, "My name is Jeff Katzenberg, and I've just gone to work for Paramount." And I was acting in Equus on Broadway at the time in New York.
So there goes little Jeffrey off trotting to New York to say to him, "You got to put the ears back on." So I went, I saw the show, and after the show, we went to Joe Allen's. I said to him, "We're going to make the movie. Those ears are going on. They're either going on you, or they're actually going to go on somebody else. But they are going to go on. And how badly will you feel when you didn't put them on?"
The big leverage that he always had, beginning with these movies, was that Paramount Pictures needed him. And they couldn't make a Star Trek movie without him.
Finally, my lawyer called. "Look, Paramount's actually showing some willingness to reach an agreement. Would you read the script if they settled the lawsuit?" "Yes." 4 days later, on a Friday evening, the lawsuit settled. My lawyer came to my house with a check. An hour later, the script arrived. I sat down and read it through that night.
Leonard Nimoy was the last person to join the movie cast and was asked why he was a holdout.
I don't think it was a question of holdout. We've had a long and complicated relationship, Paramount and myself, for the last couple of years. And probably the thing that took the most time is the fact that the mail service between here and Balkan is still pretty slow.
Spock.
Making that first movie was very, very dispiriting, very depressing. We had a bad script that just never worked. It was always a struggle to try to figure out how to bring some life to this project. And we did our best, but I never, the pendulum swung completely when that first movie came along, from being an actor and character-oriented Star Trek to an effects-oriented Star Trek. And the feeling was, well, we didn't have the money before, now we got the money, we've got to give them a big effects movie. So it was all about the ship, and this effect, and that effect, and we're going through this thing. And now we're going through that thing. nothing about the characters. So it was frustrating and depressing and very painful.
In Star Trek II, the lure that Harve Bennett gave him was, you're going to have the greatest death scene of all time.
Spock! No!
I thought that was the final Star Trek movie. And when they said to me, how about a death scene, I thought, why not? If this is the end of Star Trek, let's go out in a blaze of glory, saving the Enterprise, you know? Be a hero and die.
Live long and prosper.
Then, sooner than I realized, it was over.
Oh.
I stripped off the ears, the makeup, the uniform, until Spock gradually disappeared, leaving behind only Leonard Nimoy. Never again the raised eyebrow, never again the delicious teasing of the irascible doctor, or the offering of logic to my impetuous friend and captain. Never again the mind meld, the neck pinch, or the Vulcan salute and blessing. Live long and prosper. I asked myself, what have I done? Well, of course, they put in a little footage at the end of the movie that suggested that this might not be the end of Spock.
I'm sorry, Doctor. I have no time to discuss this logically. Remember.
And they came to me, sure enough, after the picture opened and did business, and they called me in for a meeting. They said, we'd like to know if you'd like to be involved in another Star Trek movie. And I said, yes, I'd like to direct it.
I remember distinctly one night, I got a phone call from him, and he said he'd been on the phone with Michael Eisner, and that Michael Eisner was trying to talk him out of directing, making his directing debut, directing himself in a feature film and so forth. And he said, was asking me, he was soliciting my advice. I said, well, it's really very simple. Are you prepared to let this ship sail without you? And he said, oh, absolutely. I said, then sit tight, you're going to direct the movie.
My lord, the ship appears to be deserted.
How can that be? They're hiding.
Yes, sir. But the bridge seems to be run by computer. It is the only thing speaking.
Speaking? Let me hear.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
Get out!
3.
Get out of there!
I got a call before the movie opened from Jeff Katzenberg, who was head of production at Paramount at the time. And he said, we want you to make another one. And I said, you know, this one that I just finished, Star Trek 3, I said, you had a pretty tight choke chain on me, controlling what I was doing and making me answer for everything and explain everything I was doing and justify everything. And he said, I'll never forget, he was wonderful. He said, the training wheels are off. We want you to make your Star Trek movie.
Well, if it isn't Robin Hood and Friar Tuck. Where you fellas heading?
Back to San Francisco.
Came all the way down here just to jump in and swim with the kiddies, huh?
Very little point in my trying to explain.
Well, yeah, I'll buy that. What about him?
Him? He's harmless. Back in the 60s, he was part of the free speech movement at Berkeley. I think he did a little too much LDS.
LDS? Come on, why don't you let me give you a lift? We had our first read-through at your house on Kashmir, and he had the Whales song playing for us, and I knew then how much this project meant to him on a personal level. He was trying to get us to get it, which to me transcends doing another Star Trek film, although in fact it actually is what Star Trek has always been about, which is meaningful issues about how to live.
Just where is our future? The things we've done and said. Let's just push the button. We'd be better off dead. 'Cause I
Excuse me. Excuse me. Would you mind stopping that noise?
The sins of all our fathers picked up on us the sons. The only choice we're given is how many megatons.
Excuse me. Would you mind stopping that damn noise?
Say screw you, and I hope you're blue too. We're all bloody worthless.
Star Trek IV was one of the highlights of Dad's career, really part of the pinnacle of his career, because immediately after that came 3 Men and a Baby.
The making of 3 Men and a Baby was a magical time where everything came together beautifully. I felt enormously fortunate to be involved with the project.
Nice job, Pete.
You know, the LA Times came out with an article when that movie came out, and it was a hit, the winter season, the holiday season of '87. LA Times talked about the fact that the hit from the previous holiday season was a feature film entitled Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, and that both of those films happened to be directed by the same guy. Then came The Good Mother, and my relationship with my father hit an all-time low.
And you've left her alone with him.
Well, of course I have. She likes him. They have fun together, Brian.
Well, ask him about the fun, Anna.
Well, what are you suggesting, Brian, that he did something wrong with Molly?
He did, Anna.
Well, he didn't.
She told me. She's told the shrink. He did it,
No,
Anna.
Brian,
You
he
ask
didn't
him.
do it.
And you let him.
By the time filming of The Good Mother wrapped, I felt the same way I had at the end of shooting 3 Men and a Baby. I thought, boy, this could be even more of a rocket ride than 3 Men. And it was a rocket ride, all right. Straight down. Box office was disappointing, and the film soon disappeared from the theaters. I started drinking regularly, ritually, during probably the second year or third year of our series. The ritual became so ingrained and so important to me because I looked forward to that release at the end of the pressure of the day with the dialogue and the pace and get the 15 pages or 12 pages done today and all of that sort of thing. And the minute we finished the last shot, I would have a drink. And then it became a series of drinks, and little by little, before I knew it, I was drinking more and more because my addictive personality was taking over.
It was the martinis, you know, getting a drink when you come home, having a couple drinks. And, you know, while it made him more relaxed, he also shut down.
The habit grew to the power that it did in my later years because I didn't have that thought, I'm young, I still have a distance to go, which is a devilish part of the disease.
The 1980s were a very difficult time for my dad. His parents had recently died, my grandparents, within 6 months of each other. My dad was going through a very complicated and difficult divorce from my mother. They had been married for 32 years. It was also about this time that there was a lot of headbanging between the two of us. There were a lot of old issues that were coming up, and there were a number of fights between us. He was also drinking. A lot of this was fueled by alcohol. And quite frankly, I was still getting high at the time, and that was certainly not helping matters between us. There is one major area that I should touch on before coming to a conclusion: competition with my father. This was easy for me in a strangely painful way. My father never earned more than $150 a week. I realized that competition with me is very tough. I am very loud and verbal. Also, I have been very lucky, made good money, and I'm famous. That's a lot tougher to deal with than me competing against a $150 a week barber. A lot of the problems that I had with my dad were not that dissimilar from problems that other fathers and sons experience. The difference is that my dad was adored by millions of fans all over the world, and oftentimes I felt like I was competing with them for his love and attention. And sometimes I honestly felt like I was losing the battle. After we would have one of these incredible knockdown, drag-out fights, I would go out into the world and be confronted by images of Spock everywhere.
I wanna know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy. Pure energy.
In 1989, Dad and Susan got married, and his domestic life started to get much better. She was a real stabilizing force for him, and he was very happy with her, and they were very devoted to each other. It was at this period of time, he told me later on, that he was really happy with his life, and yet didn't really understand why he was still drinking. And it was at that point that he started to really seriously look at what was happening with his life, and he made his decision to go into his own recovery.
My first images were photographed with this camera and enlarged with this camera, and with about 20 cents worth of Kodak supplies. And I just became fascinated with the ability to create an image, something that you could hold, an object that you could hold in your hand, and there it is, something I shot this morning, and tonight I have the picture in my hand. I can hang it on my wall or give it to my family or whatever. That was the beginning.
Although Dad started taking pictures at an early age, he continued this hobby throughout his life. He would often take portraits of me and Julie, and some of those ended up in the poetry books he published. James T. Kirk. Along came JJ Abrams, who found a way to crack it open to an entirely new and different audience.
Who the hell am I to tell Leonard Nimoy what Spock should do? But it's my job, so I'm doing the best I can. But I was amazed at how open he was. Leonard was okay with the idea of this new incarnation of Star Trek. It set a tone on the set even beyond the days that Leonard was working.
You didn't have to know all about Star Trek. You could come and enjoy this movie as a person who had never seen anything of Star Trek before. Fascinating. What?
Okay, I'm sure you're just doing your job, but could you not come a wee bit sooner? 6 months I've been here, living off Star Trek protein nibs and the promise of a good meal.
Myself, Leonard, and Chris shared a trailer when we were shooting the stuff when they discover Scotty on the planet. And it was quite far from the circus, from the unit base, so we had a trailer that we just sat in and we shared. And we were shooting really late at night. It was like, you know, 2 or 3 in the morning, and Chris, Leonard, and I were just sat in this. And Leonard was in his full Spock regalia, ears. We had the big sort of like winter coat on and stuff, and he sat upright, and he went to sleep. And he was just sat there, just quietly snoring. And Chris and I were just looking at each other like,
We were shooting a scene, and Leonard was walking, and he fell. And he landed, and he cut and broke his nose. So the feeling that, you know, you have when someone that you care about as much as I did, of course, gets hurt. It's a horrible feeling. When you've wounded Spock, you just want to, you know, kill yourself. It's just, it was horrible. And we're trying to figure out what we're going to do for the rest of the day. And I hear like, oh, no, we're going to keep going. And it was Leonard who's like, we're just going to keep shooting. And I'm thinking, is he out of his fucking mind? He just broke his nose. And Leonard was like, let's keep going. And we finished, and no one ever heard the story publicly until you and I had this conversation.
Speak your mind, Spock.
That would be unwise.
Mine is a very different Spock than your dad's. I was really fortunate to be able to explore even more than your dad, because as entertainment evolved, as narration evolved, as storytelling evolved over the intervening decades between when he created the role and when I assumed it, I think that it opened up a little bit more space for us to get in and play with that.
Mr. Spock.
Sharing that with him and discussing it and exploring it through the context of our personal relationship, that was probably one of the most creatively satisfying aspects of assuming a role that had already been established so firmly and created so boldly, no pun intended.
Should I choose to complete the Vulcan discipline of Kolinar and purge all emotion, I trust you will not feel it reflects judgment upon you.
As always, whatever you choose to be, you will have a proud mother.
Every time he goes into a negative place, he starts being a little bit of a pessimist. He allows Uhura and Kirk to snap him out of it, and I really like that. He's a man to me. Like, Spock is really a man. Even though he's half alien, it's like, he could have been, I don't know, half anything, but he's still very much natural.
I thought that was a perfect example of the evolution of the character, of painting him in a different light and seeing that there is this capacity for feeling, for emotion, for intimacy, for connection. It's still regulated. It's still within the boundaries or the parameters of what it means to be Vulcan.
Father.
I am not our father. There are so few Vulcans left, we cannot afford to ignore each other. Spock, in this case, do yourself a favor. Put aside logic. Do what feels right. Since my customary farewell would appear oddly self-serving, I shall simply say, good luck.
Dad was really happy to be in the new incarnation of Star Trek. It was a high point for him. But much like Spock's problems with his father, my relationship with my father was still very troubled.
My first officer, Commander Spock.
Vulcan honors us with your presence. We come to serve.
Your service honors us, Captain.
Thank you.
Around 2006, we were just about completely estranged from one another. Old issues were flaring up, and I was at a low point in my life. I had just ended an 18-year marriage, and I had decided to go into my own 12-step recovery. And it was a real difficult time for the two of us, and basically for 3 or 4 years, we had very, very little communication. By around 2008, we started to talk again and reconnect again and really came back together in our relationship with each other. I had met Martha in a doctor's office, and she was my age, and she was very sweet, fun, attractive woman. And I started dating her regularly, and I mean, I was so much happier having Martha that I married her. 4.5 months after we were married, Martha was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The weird thing was for me, and I was really kind of conscious of it now in retrospect, was that in 2004, when I left my 18-year marriage and moved out of my house and left my kids behind for a while, I mean, it was a real low point in my life. I didn't even call my dad. He wasn't even on the list because of our period of, beginning of the estrangement period. But when I was able to pull myself back together after I got that phone call from the doctor, the first phone call I made.
Was to your dad.
It just overwhelms me now that we could get to that point where he could be my go-to guy.
Yeah.
And in the next 18 months of my life with Martha, which were, probably the most challenging possibly in my entire life, my dad and Susan were there every step of the way to support me and keep me going. And after that, my dad and I never again looked back at the wreckage from our past, ever. So here we are. You are a man, an individual, very bright, talented, goal-oriented, sensitive, and a lot of other good things. Above all, I want you to know that you are priceless to me. I'm proud of you, and I deeply love you. Your father.
My life has become much, much more about family. The way I describe it now was I used to major in career and minor in family. And now I've turned it around. I'm much more majoring in family and minoring in career. I do an occasional pop-up thing here and there for friends, but mostly I'm dealing with my family.
With Dad marrying our stepmom, Susan, she and Aaron became a part of our family. She was great in the fact that she showed Dad that being with your children and your grandchildren it's very important. You need to be a part of their life. And let's bring everybody together. Let's have a big family unit, and we have a big family.
In the last years of his life were the times that the family got together at the house for any variety of occasions, from birthdays to holidays. Leonard was a very even-keeled guy, didn't always show a lot of emotion, but I'd say those times at which he would toast the family at those gatherings were the times I maybe saw him express the most emotion. He was so grateful to have everybody there. He was grateful to feel the love from everybody that was there, and he was grateful to be able to love the family the way that he did and provide for the family the way that he could.
The day Leonard died, and he was in a coma, I leaned over and said to him, "You made the world stand up and listen." And I'd swear he nodded his head.
What I admired about Leonard was his willingness to love his family. And because I was on the periphery of it, I got that love. It made him a wonderful actor in the work we did, and I think it made him a mensch. Probably a word you're going to hear a lot.
Mensch. A mensch is someone who's responsible and disciplined, and you can count on.
He was just this stable force in my life, and I knew I could always count on him.
He was the mensch of mensches.
He was loved and adored by, I think, everybody on the set.
To create a character who leaves a mark on the society that strikes a chord that resonates. Leonard Nimoy did that.
If there was a word you would use to sum up or describe either my dad as an individual or Spock, the character, what would that be for you?
The first word that springs to mind for both of them actually is, I would say, is noble. There was something about, there's definitely something about Spock which is very noble. You know, he's obviously a man of massive integrity and conviction.
If I had to pick one word, it would be dignity.
Artist.
Integrity.
Human.
He was a self-made Renaissance man, but he had a ubiquitous curiosity about everything going on in the world, whether it was art, photography, politics.
Logical.
Humble.
Hope. Cool. Spock was cool.
I think a little bit of Spock needs to be behind every important decision we make in our lives, about ourselves or with regard to others.
The first word that does come to mind is loving.
Love.
If it's free association, then it's definitely just love. What's yours?
Didn't know what time it was, the lights were low. I leaned back on my radio. Some cat was laying down some rock and roll, so sad. And then the loud sound, it seemed to fade. Came back like a slow voice on a wave of haze. That was no DJ, that was hazy cosmic jive. There's a starman waiting in the sky. He'd like to come and meet us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds. There's a starman waiting in the sky. He's told us not to blow it, 'cause he knows it's all worthwhile. He told me, let the children use it, let the children use it, let all the children boogie. Hey, that's far out, so you heard him too. Switch on the TV, we may pick him up on channel 2. Look out your window, I can see his light. If we can sparkle, he may land tonight. or he'll get us locked